Okay, now we're recording. So, Philani, welcome to our session. We are super happy to have you here. I introduced you briefly to all the participants during the first hour, but basically, you are the executive director of the Institute of Global Dialogue. You are also the founder of a Berlin Global Forum, which is also dedicated to promoting dialogue on global politics. And I'm pretty sure I could say that you are also a change maker. For what I've seen in the way your opinions, but also the way you work to promote global dialogue, South-South cooperation, your engagement at the political and the policy level, I would say that in my view, and this is one of the reasons why I admire you a lot, and also I'm very happy to invite you today. And this is the first really joint action that we are going to have, and I hope it's only the first and the beginning. I'm very happy to welcome you and to give everyone the opportunity to listen to all what you have to say about global politics, South Africa, Africa, and the relationship with China, Asia, emerging economies, and also because we are, with Brazilians, we are also very interested in understanding your thoughts and input on what's going on with the BRICS, etc. So the idea is simply to listen to you in the next 30, 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for everyone to ask you questions, make some comments and whatever, and hopefully have fun. So thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, and thank you, colleagues. Much appreciated. I'm glad to be having this conversation. In fact, we just did something recently with all the Mercosur embassies here in South Africa about a week or two ago, where we were commemorating the 30th anniversary of Mercosur. And one of the things we were discussing is really how to increase, South-South cooperation, given the fact that many of our countries, because of our history, because of the current geopolitical dynamics, are very entrenched in terms of their relations with the West. And our countries have close relations with Europe. Our countries have close relations with the United States. And I think one of the things that we were really discussing is that if you look in South African and in many African universities, you looked at doctoral theses and the type of questions that are being asked, and not only the questions, but the type of research that is being undertaken. Too much of it is still too focused on what is happening in the US, what is, the role of the US in the world, the role of the European Union, South Africa, in Africa. But we don't have enough work that is actually being undertaken to look at a whole range of other regions that are promoting South-South cooperation. And I think one of the things that we've been saying is that at a people-to-people level, this is one of the areas where we need to actually make a lot more progress. We need to be having a lot more conversations between the peoples, the researchers of the global South, between Africa, Latin America, between Africa and Asia. And by doing that over time, we will unlock the opportunities for greater South-South cooperation. And that's where I'm going to really focus my discussion. It's, I'll situated within the broader dynamics of the cause, which is, of course, on shifting global dynamics and South-South cooperation. But specifically today, focusing on the power shifts towards the East and the South, and what consequences these power shifts actually have for Africa within South-South cooperation. And I'll just start with something that is affecting all of us, which is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, and how this pandemic is also serving the purpose of actually accelerating the shifts that we have been looking at prior to the pandemic. I think one thing that is very clear is that whilst the current pandemic started in China, and quickly spread to parts of Southeast Asia, is if you look at the manner in which the countries of Southeast Asia have dealt with the pandemic, both the health effects but also the economic impacts and the political impacts of the pandemic, you would find that those countries and that region of the world is the fastest in terms of re-emerging from the most serious elements of the pandemic. And of course, now, yes, we've got a very serious situation happening in India, for instance, which is being hit by a very bad wave. But I think if you look at particularly the East Asian countries, you look at Vietnam, you look at China, you look at, even South Korea. And one thing that I think that signals is that those are the countries that are able to get their economies working as close to normal, as close to pre-pandemic normal levels than other countries in the world. I think one of the things that surprised many scholars and many of those who were predicting, that Africa would be also very badly hit by this pandemic, is that what they failed to factor into their calculations is that African countries have been on an almost yearly basis dealing with different kinds of epidemics, whether it is HIV and AIDS, whether it is Ebola, and a whole range of epidemics that have actually been hitting the continent in recent years. So I think what they failed to factor in is the institutional capacities that had been actually built up by African countries, irrespective of the limited resources that they were operating under. And the mere fact that, Africa knew that the infrastructure, the health infrastructure is relatively poor compared to many parts of the world. And I think there was a realization that we simply cannot afford to be run over, by this pandemic. So if you look at many parts of Africa, you would see that whereas we've not been really badly affected by the health effects of the pandemic, is that where we have been affected is the economic and the political aspects. Because over the last 20 years, out of the fastest growing economies in the world, the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, for the last 20 years, consistently, you have 6 or 7 of the fastest growing economies actually coming from Africa. So, the continent has been growing rapidly. Of course, it has still many challenges. It still confronts challenges of poverty, corruption, poor infrastructure. All of those challenges are still there. But it's important when looking at the continent and trying to understand why is it that countries of the global south like China and India and others, Brazil, have expanded their relations with the continent in the past decade and more. One has to basically rewind here. And I go back to China and India in the 1970s. China and India were essentially the two largest recipients of development cooperation in the world in the 70s. They had massive poverty in their countries. I mean, China was really going through a number of socioeconomic challenges. Livelihoods were not very prosperous in China. So you're dealing with countries, and of course today you still have massive level of poverty in India, but they've made relative progress in dealing with some of those challenges. Now, you fast forward to 2020, last year, China officially declared that there is no more extreme poverty in China. They declared an end to extreme poverty 10 years ahead of the global target of ending extreme poverty by 2030. Now, we have to then understand, why would China in the year 2000 want to initiate, for instance, something like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation? And in order to understand that, what was happening in 2000, you can turn to an article that was done by The Economist, in fact, a cover article, where in the year 2000, The Economist was referring to Africa as the hopeless continent. They essentially were looking at Africa not as an opportunity, but they were looking at Africa as a basket case, as a case for charity, but not really as a place, for opportunity, not only for themselves, but also for the world. Now, at that time, China made a different calculation. They understood very well that they had also emerged from decades of poverty. They understood that there was opportunity in actually enhancing South-South cooperation with African countries. And they made a calculated bet, and they said, we're going to enhance cooperation through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and not only look at Africa in a sense of as a charity case and in a form of development assistance, but they saw Africa as an opportunity for their own businesses, for their own people, for their own state-owned enterprises to actually engage more with the continent, because they saw opportunity in actually working with Africa to address some of the socioeconomic challenges. So they actively encouraged Chinese corporations to go out of China and look for opportunities in Africa. They incentivized their companies to come into the continent. And of course, that had an effect, because whereas other countries in the developed world were largely looking at Africa from a donor-recipient perspective, it forced them to relook and to reevaluate some of their perceptions on Africa. I mean, this is a continent that still has, massive resources. I mean, you can just imagine that throughout the colonial period, there was an exploitation of resources in Africa, mineral resources, human resources, and these resources were being exploited without any regulation at all. So for a period of about 400 years, you had these resources being exploited. Yet even today, you still have massive resources in the continent, and new resources are still being found, whether gas deposits on the Indian Ocean, new oil resources, and a whole range of other minerals are still being found. In fact, if we think about what are the minerals that are going to be powering the fourth industrial revolution, a lot of those minerals that are powering are going to be coming from Africa. So the continent still has resources, but in addition to those resources, it has human resources. It has a growing middle class. By 2050, the African population would have doubled its size. I mean, with the youngest population in the world, which means you've got a growing number of productive people who could potentially work in factories, work in all different industries, if investors were to set up on the continent. And with that, I think you've increasingly, through South-South cooperation, so through a growing interest from China, from India, and from other countries in the global South, in expanding their relations in Africa, it actually forced Western countries to re-examine their own perceptions on Africa. And to not look at the continent purely from a donor-recipient perspective. And I think this, in a sense, was a positive thing, not only in terms of South-South cooperation, but in terms of the development prospects of Africa as a continent. Because whereas the continent had become too dependent on its relations with Western countries, I mean, if you look at Africa's relations with the West, you see that, for instance, the budget of the African Union, more than 2/3 of the budget of the African Union comes from the European Union, right? And if you follow dominant media narratives, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that, for instance. But the moment that the Chinese go and they build the headquarters of the African Union, there's a huge storm in the in the media, and it's almost as though China is now, you've got that perception of whether it is a neo-colonial power and all of those dynamics. So one thing we have to always examine when looking at Africa's relation with China and others is also how information gets overly politicized. That there is a fear in the West that China's growing footprint will have a negative impact. They will say they will have a negative impact for Africans, but essentially what they're saying is that it will have a negative impact on their interests in Africa. So there's that politicization of information, right? And you see that China expanded its footprint in Africa since the year 2000. It has a strategic partnership with Africa. Many African countries are now looking at China as their largest trade partner. However, it's important to take into account that despite the fact that, yes, China is now Africa's largest trade partner, it's important to keep in mind that this does not necessarily mean that Europe and the US have a diminished role on the continent, and that China is now suddenly the preeminent player in Africa. In fact, Africa is still largely dependent on its relations with Europe. A country like South Africa, 70% of its foreign direct investment, it comes from the EU and EU countries, not from China. China might be South Africa's biggest trade partner, but Europe still plays a disproportionate role when it comes to our economic relations. So these are the things to keep in mind, that whilst China is playing a much greater role in Africa, it is not the only player. Europe still maintains a very strong presence on the continent, whether it's in the form of military ties, whether it's a form of economic ties or political ties. But how African countries view China and view other countries in the global south is they view it as a form of diversifying their relations. They do not see them as as um, as replacing the West, but they see it as a form of diversifying their relations, their international relations, which of course is important, because you wouldn't want the African continent to be perpetually dependent on its relations with the West. You would want African countries to have more options. You would want African countries to engage more, yes, with Europe, but to also engage more with Asia and to engage more with Latin America, with the Middle East and other countries and other regions of the world. And I think this is the trend that has been gradually taking place over the past 2 decades on the continent. And it's an important trend for Africa because it allows it to diversify its international relations. And I think this is something that is going to be important moving forward if Africa is going to create the necessary industries, the necessary job opportunities to actually cater for a growing population by 2050. If by 2050, the continent would have doubled its population, the question is, will we have created enough industries, enough jobs, enough employment to actually ensure that young people in Africa are able to live productive lives? And it is in that framework that African countries see it in their strategic interests to expand their relations with the global south, with China, with India, and a whole range of countries within the global south, including the BRICS countries. And I think when you look at that, is that, when you take, for instance, an example like the BRICS are not seeking to revolutionize global politics, even though some would want them to do that. But they are more reformers, than sort of revisionists when it comes to international relations. So if you look at the approach that has been followed by countries like South Africa and fellow BRICS countries, is that they have tried to reform existing global institutions to factor in the fact that they should no longer reflect a post-World War II victory, of the Allies. What they should factor in is the current changes that have taken place in global politics. And therefore, there should be more voices for developing countries. There should be more voices for emerging economies and so forth in institutions of global governance. So what they've sought to do is, yes, to reform existing institutions, but at the same time, when they get frustrated with the pace of reform at existing institutions, what they have done is they've gone outside of existing institutions to actually go and found their own institutions, such as the BRICS, such as the BRICS New Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and a whole range of institutions. I mean, if you look at all the BRICS countries, they all have development finance institutions and that they can actually apply and put resources towards the ideas that they hold. So in South Africa, we've got the development finance institutions like your Development Bank of Southern Africa, You've got the Industrial Development Corporation, which invests in development projects within Africa and the global south. And I think this is really some of the changes that have enabled Africa as a continent to actually reach some of these high growth targets that they've reached in the last 2 decades. I mean, the mere fact that 6 or 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world have been African economies consistently. And if you look at these 6 or 7 economies, these are not just countries with that are endowed in terms of natural resources. These are also African countries that do not have natural resources. These are also countries that do not necessarily, have huge populations, and these are also landlocked countries. So what it tells you is that you've got a much more diversified sources of growth that are happening within Africa. And a big part of that explanation, I would argue, in the context of this particular cause, is the fact that countries of the global south have started to play a greater role in international affairs. And in playing a greater role in international affairs, they have created more options for African countries in politics, in trade, and in development finance, and a whole range of areas. So for instance, an example, when Angola went to the World Bank and said, can you please finance our infrastructure projects? We have just emerged from a long civil war. Please, we need to build infrastructure. We need to build electricity infrastructure. We need to build road infrastructure and a whole range of other projects that will propel our development. When the World Bank looked at that and said, no, we can't finance this project. It is too expensive. We do not see how we will recoup our money. We don't think you will be able to pay it back. Then when Angola goes to China, and China actually funds that project, and actually funds it more than what Angola was requesting from the World Bank, it forces institutions like the World Bank to re-examine their practices. Yes, they will criticize China. They will say China is lending to, they will say China, there's an unsustainable lending that's taking place and all of that type of stuff. But what it also does is it forces them to re-examine themselves and re-examine their own conditionalities that they used to place on developing countries. And I argue that that's a good thing for Africa as a continent, because you have more sources of finance that are available. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, what it does is it forces the African continent to be involved in a much more sophisticated and a much more complex international environment. Because, I mean, you would have noticed that even under Trump, Trump was essentially trying to force African countries to not engage with China, to reduce its engagements with China, and so forth. Now, what interest would Africa have in reducing its engagement with China when 1 in 4 infrastructure, or 1 in 5 major infrastructure projects in Africa are actually being done, by the Chinese? And, when those very same requests are not being taken on board by traditional donor countries, what it does is it forces donor countries to re-examine themselves and to understand that they cannot force African countries to choose between China and the West, because African countries simply do not have that luxury. we don't have the luxury to choose between China and the US. But what African countries can do is to become much better at using their engagement with China and their engagement with the US to meet their own development objectives. And I think this is what is where South-South cooperation has actually opened up opportunities for African countries to engage much more strategically in international relations to meet their development objectives. And I think this is where, as we emerge beyond, this pandemic, those types of trends are going to be accelerated because, China is still going to put resources in the Belt and Road Initiative. Countries like Brazil have a big presence in Africa, something like 34 embassies, I think, on the continent, which is a big footprint in Africa. Countries like India have a big presence also in Africa, a big diaspora here on the continent, and they will continue to be engaged in the continent. And what that does is it opens up the number of potential partnerships that are available for African countries. And I think if that happens, we will position Africa in a much better position to be able to use its international relations to meet its development objectives. There's a whole range of other areas I could obviously touch on, but I think maybe let me maybe end there so that we can have also the opportunity to, to have a discussion and to maybe elaborate on some of those points.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Philani. That was amazing. Thank you for your effort to explain so many things, complex things in quickly and very clearly. So yeah, I think we have a very good opportunity now, 25 minutes for everyone to ask you whatever they want to go deeper, or any other topic that maybe they are interested, and that I'm sure that obviously you were not able to present in only half an hour. So I invite everyone to start writing their questions in the chat. Remember that the first how do you say that? First come, first, blah, blah. You know what I mean.
First come, first serve.
Exactly. So if you're faster typing the question, I will be able to read it. But I was trying to make notes. Philani, what should I ask you? And I have so many questions that I need to pick one. But perhaps just, first of all, let me tell you that I'm very happy to hear that you were having this meeting with the Mercosur ambassadors, and these South-South people-to-people exchanges were one of the things that you discussed. And please count with me, with Global Change Center, most probably with Iri, with Puki, for generating this type of dialogues, any other more interactive one, long-term, short-term, creative one. So we are here to continue the conversation on that. I believe, like you, that with more dialogue and diversifying relations is the only way forward for us to put ourselves in a better footing, and not only, being in this position of recipient beneficiary, just dependent of one window or the other. And the example that you gave about Angola was excellent in that sense. So we really need to intensify our dialogue and our cooperation. So please count with us. My question, just because maybe it's more related with what we were discussing the last few days, and because it's a little bit of my passion, I'm just wondering, what do you think of in the African context, and with the African lenses? What do you think of what we call, or sometimes, the peace and development nexus? No, sometimes Africa, unfortunately, many countries in Africa suffer this imposition of what is called the liberal peace building model. And the fact that many international organizations, banks, etc., didn't really wanted to fund the economic angle or the developmental angle of peacemaking. So I'm just wondering if you have any points in regards to that, which was part of our conversation in the hour before and the days before, and what you think of that from an African angle. We'll be very keen to hear. And then I will start reading the questions that others may have.
Perfect. I think you see this, that whole peace and development nexus. I think this is where South-South cooperation has actually served the purpose of changing perspectives. Because, one of the biggest challenges in Africa when it comes to peace and security is not conflict between states. It's internal conflict within states. And a lot of that conflict has to do with the distribution of resources. It has to do with the concentration of resources. So essentially, I think when it comes to this peace and development nexus, I think one thing that was missing in the past is that traditional donors of the various African countries were less interested in putting resources in economic development and into the productive sectors of African economies, building real infrastructure. They were more interested, which of course is still important. I mean, in the social sectors, it's important, health and other areas, education. These are all important areas. But in order for African countries to succeed, they need to overcome the colonial legacy where a road was built from a mine to the ocean. Not in terms of building a road to connect people, but to build a road to connect resources with international capital. And this was a huge problem. And we need to overcome that. So, there's the Chinese saying that if you want to become rich, build a road. So, one thing that the Chinese have been very active in is in infrastructure, for instance, which is something that is really necessary on the continent. And I think that that's where South-South cooperation has played a greater role in reorienting how resources are actually transferred on the continent, because I think we are thinking a lot more about putting resources into the productive sectors, because the challenge in Africa is not arriving at a peace agreement when different sides are fighting. You often arrive, you have a negotiation process, you bring the different sides together, they agree, to put their guns away and have a ceasefire. But that is not enough. What will sustain the peace afterwards? You need economic activity and economic incentives to actually sustain the peace. Because what are you going to tell, rebel forces that were making more material resources during a conflict than after a conflict, because there's simply no economic activity that's happening in that country? Then what ends up happening is that those warring sides go back in the bush and pick up their arms again and say, look, there's no incentive for peace. So peace has to be also incentivized. Yes, with governance frameworks, accountability, and all of that. But you also need the economic incentives to actually sustain that peace. And I think this has been something that has been lacking in previous years in Africa. And it is something that, with the growing focus on investing in economic infrastructure and in the productive sector, I think that means that over a medium to longer term, we will have a better opportunity to sustain the peace. And of course, it's not going to be in a one line, in a straight line. There's going to be 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and then another 3 steps forward, and then you go back. I mean, you just look at what's happening in Mozambique, where they've discovered, gas resources, huge gas resources. And, rather than that serving the purpose of redistributing those resources to people, sustaining their livelihoods, those resources have unfortunately become one of the trigger points for conflict. So it's a difficult balance, but you need investments in the economy in order to sustain the peace. Otherwise, unfortunately, appealing only to the good-hearted and the good nature of people who have been fighting each other is not sufficient. You have to also incentivize them with material resources. And I think that's where South-South cooperation comes in and plays an important role.
Cecilia, I think her image is paused.
I think it's frozen, yeah. I think she froze.
Ah, yes, I see that she's gone blank. But I see that there's some questions in the chat.
Yes.
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 So, I mean, I'm seeing the first one around sort of the future of South America-Africa cooperation in the next following years. I think, when Africans go to South America, one of the things that, and this is one of the things that came up in our discussion with the Mercosur ambassadors, is that there is always the realization of how similar, our respective cultures and just mannerisms and all of that are, I mean, I've participated in various programs, international programs, where you are placed in an international group, where you've got people from the US, you've got people from Europe, you've got people from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East. And, in my own observations, I've always noted that the Africans and the South Americans always tend to find one another in the course of that program, and then end up spending more time together, more exchanges, and they have sort of similar orientations about life and so forth. And I think this is where, for me, where people-to-people relations become very important, because I think if we are going to build greater relations between Africa and South America, yes, on the one side, you have to build government-to-government relations, but that's not enough. It's also not enough to simply focus the relations purely on the economy and say big corporations from Africa and big corporations from South America should interact more with each other. That's fine. That should happen. But that is not enough. For me, I think we need to be doing much more joint research together between Africa and South America. We need to be encouraging much more people-to-people relations. We need to be encouraging much more cultural exchanges between Africa and South America. Because if we do that, that is what is going to actually sustain the relations over the long term. And for me, that's a real strength that we are not utilizing enough. There's great potential. Of course, people will tell you that, yes, there's a language barrier and all of these types of things. But these are all things that can be overcome. These are not things that are so big of a challenge that you cannot get over. If, for instance, in South Africa and in other parts of Africa, we create the space for more interaction between African universities and universities in South America. You have more exchanges. You send South African and African students to study there and vice versa. What that does in a medium to long-term perspective is it creates the bridges that are necessary. But besides creating the bridges that are necessary, it also allows the people of our respective regions to identify more opportunities for exchanges. And I think that is where that's the missing layer. We have all the commonalities that we can pick up. But I think for me, it's these types of initiatives, like me having the opportunity to speak to students from the region, students being able to interrogate me, question me, and even disagree with some of the some of the points that I'm putting across. For me, that's what's going to build long-term relations between Africa and South America. So yes, on the one hand side, of course, government to government is important. Relations in the private sector are important, but that's not enough. You need to build relations amongst people. You need to make it easier and more frequent for South Africans to take a holiday in Argentina or to take a holiday in Brazil or Chile or wherever, and it needs to become much more common practice. And as we do that, I think we will change the structural sort of nature of our relations with the global North. And when I say that, I always tell people from the global North that just because I am saying we need more South-South cooperation, it does not mean that I am saying we do not value our relations with the global North and so forth. But it cannot be that our relations are dominated by the global North when there is so much potential within the global South. And that's how I think we will change, at least over the long term, our relations between Africa and South America.
Lovely. Sorry, Philani, I got my internet. I don't know what happened, and I missed part of your last question. Julia, thank you so much for helping me. In the chat, I lost the following question, which I read. It was about Mozambique. I don't know, Julia, if you have it, you can read it. Or Philani, you can read it directly yourself,
Yeah.
sorry, because it's gone now for me.
So I can still see it on my side. So the second one I think was really around thoughts on the possibility of SADC supporting Mozambique against the jihadists in the north. This is something that's very important, and it links closely with the point around the peace and development nexus. There was a meeting. In fact, the SADC has been quite slow in getting involved, but it's been slow not because it did not want to get involved. It has been slow because the authorities in Mozambique have not allowed, that type of intervention to take place. So the authorities in Mozambique for a long period of time thought they had the situation under control. They thought they could deal with it on their own. And they made a mistake. Instead of turning to the region, they actually hired, private security companies, to go in and assist. And this was never going to be a sustainable position. And you fast forward, you have about, you have hundreds of and thousands of people, displaced internally. You've got lives that are lost. And then suddenly a realization from Mozambique that yes, they cannot deal with the situation on their own. It's unfortunate that there was a meeting that was supposed to happen yesterday and today between the heads of state at SADC. There is a technical team that has been sent to SADC to look at what type of support Mozambique would require from a military side, but also from a humanitarian side. And I'm pretty sure that in the next few weeks, we will get an official announcement of SADC involvement in the country. And that will be likely the SADC standby force, which might be a few thousand, soldiers from the different countries in SADC, which would go into Mozambique to try and keep the peace, but also to fight, the terrorists in the north. But I think what's going to be important in SADC's intervention is that it should not just be a military-led intervention. Yes, the military aspect is important because on the other side, you've got people who are killing people, who are chopping people's heads off, who are, disrupting livelihoods of people on the ground. So you need the military side. But I think what SADC will do well to do is to also have a strong developmental approach, because SADC will have to deal with the Mozambican counterparts about addressing the root causes of the conflict in Mozambique. So the distribution of resources when it comes to these large corporations that are exploiting the gas resources in Mozambique. If you don't deal with those questions, then you're not going to resolve the problem that's happening. And my hope is that whilst in the next few weeks you will have an announcement from SADC of involvement, is that involvement must not only be focused on the military, but it must have a strong developmental and humanitarian aspect to it, because that's the only way you can deal with the root causes and actually sustain the peace over a long term period of time, which means the Mozambican government also has to look within and say, what are some of the governance failures that have actually contributed to this crisis? And then I see there's another one on the WTO. So a decline of multilateralism, crisis in the WTO, and what role South-South cooperation could have, in terms of relating with some of these dynamics. I think what's been happening is that even before COVID-19 hit, is that you already had in the global north, you already had a crisis of multilateralism, because what we saw, for instance, in the WTO, particularly in the Doha round, is that when countries of the global south were becoming stronger, were becoming more assertive, when it came to global trade and having a developmental approach to trade, rather than this purely neoliberal approach that was dominant under a Washington consensus, is what you saw is that developed countries started pulling away from the WTO and started to try and forge their own trade agreements through your transatlantic trade and investment partnership, your trans-Pacific partnership, and a whole range of others. Like the EU would go and have agreements with African countries outside of the WTO, because they did not want to discuss the reforms that were needed within the WTO, as they saw some of their power waning in those institutions. So, it's the irony is that the countries that founded these multilateral institutions are now pulling out of those multilateral institutions. I mean, we saw Trump with the World Health Organization. I mean, they are pulling out of institutions that they helped set up. And the irony is that it is countries of the global south that are now emerging, you know, as the defenders of a multilateral fora, multilateralism, and so on and so forth. So I think countries of the South will continue to play an important and a growing role in multilateral structures, which of course will be accompanied by their growing material resources also. So whether it's in the World Bank, whether it's in the IMF, whether it's in the WTO, whether it is in the various agencies of the UN, we must have a stronger voice, I think, for the global south, because it can only enrich, you know, what is actually happening within those institutions. I mean, you know, sort of as a last point on this, is that if you look at the development approach that has been followed by Western countries, and I think this links sort of also with what someone is saying around issues of climate change here, is that if you look at the development model that has been followed by Western countries, Southern countries cannot afford to follow that model. It is not sustainable. In fact, if we follow that Western model of development, if we look at development through the narrative and through the lens of the West, we might need to colonize a few more planets because our current resources are simply not going to be enough. You know, there's a scholar here in South Africa who used to always say that if Africa is supposed to follow the Western model of development, then Africa needs to go and colonize a few continents. It needs to have free labor through slavery for a few hundred years, not pay the people for their labor, you know, and who's gonna do that in this modern day? Nobody wants to do that. We don't want to do that. We wouldn't want to do that. So it's not sustainable. And I think Africa has to play an important role because we are still the continent with a lot of resources. We still have a lot of our wildlife. We still have our forests. We have our rivers. But we cannot follow the Western development model because if we do that, we will destroy our resources. And this is where innovation has to come in, where development has to be sustainable. And to do that, we can draw on a lot of indigenous knowledge about development, about life in general. And I think if we can do that, we will stand a much better chance to actually promote more sustainable livelihoods. And I think this is something that Africa shouldn't just do, and not just Africa, but others in the global south. Is these ideas that are coming from the south have to find a way of influencing the West also. Because if the West doesn't change their ways, then unfortunately we're going to create a catastrophe in terms of climate change. You know, the irony here is that whilst you have Western countries sort of leading the discussion on climate change and sustainable development and all of that, the irony is that when the colonial era was beginning and there was this massive exploitation of resources, an imbalance between human life and nature, is that it is the people of the global south that were telling our friends in the West to say what you are doing is not sustainable. What you are doing will end up impacting all of us negatively. And that is what we have seen happening. And therefore, I think countries of the South have to be much more innovative in terms of thinking about development in general and thinking about how human society needs to coexist, you know, with its natural environment.
That's amazing, Philani. Thank you for also helping yourself with the questions. I can see them now, and I love how you're flowing with everybody. That's truly amazing. If you have, I don't know, we are already past 4 minutes, but if you have a couple of more minutes, I think you touched the last question on climate change, and someone is sharing some paper there about insights and green growth. But if you have a couple of more minutes, because you are saying so many important things, I have 2 final questions. One, I would like to hear your opinion of if there is going to be any change with having a Nigerian woman in the WTO. What is African thinking about that? How is that or not an opportunity also for a new model of trade, a new model of economic development, etc.? And then the second, and I think this from a Latin American perspective, this Southern developmental, new, innovative, sustainable development model, which also, you know, Brazil play a very big role in all that discussion. What did happen in many Latin American countries, including Brazil and Argentina, is that progressive South, you know, governments, at the end of the day, got trapped in destructive model, you know, mining, destructive industry, focusing only in soybean, agribusiness, and not really were unable, because we need all the money from the exports of these commodities. So is there anyone in Africa that is giving us another idea? Because in Latin America, they didn't work. Even Evo Morales, who had the Buen Vivir model, you know, at the end of the day, it's selling lithium by tons and tons to China. And China doesn't seem to be, you know, when we asked on Monday to Hayward, he said, oh, with the Global South, we can provide, you can provide natural resources. No, I mean, yes, but no. So how can we escape that trap? What do you think? Is there someone in Africa, some country, that something that you can give us a model, a light?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think this is very important because I think maybe firstly just on the WTO, I think having somebody there, Nigerian woman, African woman at the WTO, it's something, of course, it's very important, and it's something that many in Africa are celebrating. And they are celebrating it not because they are naive and think that she can now change everything, but they appreciate, I think, that having somebody there who is African and who is a woman, it will bring different perspectives when it comes to the various negotiations around the reform of the WTO. And it is important to have people who can bring a different perspective within the higher echelons of these global institutions. Also because, I mean, they will also be applying pressure on her to take forward Africa's concerns, and not just Africa's concerns, but the concerns of the global South when it comes to the international trading system. So yes, I think there's optimism about that in terms of her potential to play a contributory role there. But I think also there is some realism in terms of not having too high expectations, but to sort of understand that she is in a structure that needs reform. And that needs nation states to actually support, her, whatever reform agenda that is necessary. But it is important that that she is there at the helm, because she'll definitely bring voices that the previous heads of the WTO would maybe not be as sensitive to. And then I just think in terms of these Southern development models, I think our countries have, unfortunately, many of our countries have aspired to look like their former oppressors, like their former colonizers, and so our idea of development is poisoned. I think we need to undo some of the learning that that we have, for instance, to understand that when we look at the great forests in Central Africa, it would be a shame if all of those and everything in those forests just ends up, in some factory in China or in some factory in, in other parts of the world, making different furniture and just, shipping it back here. The challenge for our countries is to overcome the structural imbalances, because those imbalances lock us into a particular development model. So even a country, like South Africa, which has a big mining industry, and where the mining industry played a central role in the exploitation of labor for many, many years, and, in South Africa, the discussion is, okay, how do you then ensure that you improve the conditions of the workers and so forth? But I think that's still a narrow discussion. The bigger discussion that we should be having is actually, what is development? If we look at countries in the West and we say they are developed countries, that's problematic. Because if development is destroying the entire earth, if development is developing a very small percentage of the global population at the expense of the majority, that is very problematic. And I think we are unfortunately not yet questioning those fundamental questions on what is development, what are we actually trying to achieve as countries. What do we mean by if we want to create better livelihoods for our people? So I think, we need to move away from this sort of very consumerist approach, that many countries have actually taken, in the world. And I think there's an opportunity at least in some of our countries, both in Africa and in Latin America, to say, yes, you can have all the modern infrastructure, the roads, the internet, and all these different tools, without necessarily compromising, our actual relationship with nature. Fortunately, here in Africa, we're still at a position where, unlike, other parts of the world, we haven't killed all of our nature. You can still drive 1 hour from Johannesburg, or 40 minutes from Johannesburg, and still, get into a car and do a game drive and watch elephants and lions and all of that walking in their natural habitat. Now, what happened there is that the only reason we have that, and I think South Africa is a good example, because in the early 1900s, all of our wild animals had almost been decimated. I mean, it was almost, like in Europe.
Yeah.
And then the people actually woke up and said, but, what will we do once we've actually destroyed all of this? And so what we started talking was even things like tourism. You started to say, how do we ensure that the resources that we gain from tourism are actually going towards the conservation of our natural environment? So surely there has to be a way where we can redesign our economies where the incentive around economic activity is also the preservation, of our natural environment, and to ensure that we are able to leave something behind for future generations. So I think we need, our thinking over the last maybe 400 years has been very short-term thinking. We don't think in generational and many generations down the line, which was how indigenous societies actually tended to think about life anyway. And I think we need to elevate some of these voices that were on the periphery and elevate them into the mainstream about rethinking basic ideas of development, rethinking basic ideas of wealth accumulation and capital accumulation. Because if we don't do that, then unfortunately, we are going to go back to normal after this pandemic. But normal is actually not where we want to be. We want to rethink our whole systems, our economic systems, our political systems. And if we can do that, I think we will then, for me, that's really the challenge of the global south. For me, the challenge of the global south is to not become the global north, just in different clothing. For me, the challenge of South-South cooperation is to really bring the ideas from the global south, from the peoples of the global south, and to see how we can actually turn those into sustainable livelihoods for our people and move away from that Western development model, which has had a very destructive impact on our planet. And I think that happens, it's such a difficult process because it happens in politics, it happens through grassroots movements.
Yeah.
You've got grassroots movements here in South Africa where in the Eastern Cape, they wanted to open a new mine. And the community said, no, we don't want the mine. We know that we don't want the jobs associated with the mines. We don't want any of that and the potential impacts that it would have on our communities. And they fought the government, they fought the local authorities up to national authorities, and they won. Eventually, they won to say that foreign direct investment cannot be at the expense of sustainable livelihoods. And I think those small initiatives, if they grow, it will help us to change our perspective on development. But of course, that's a big task.
We are together to do that.
Yeah, we have to, I think.
That's amazing, Philani. I confirm what I said at the beginning, that also you are not only an expert in international relations and global politics, but a change maker, because you are exactly ending with that message, which is giving us a vision of change. So I really appreciate that. A very big applause to you. I really hope that there is another time. I'm putting the Institute for Global Dialogue Facebook page and for everyone to follow and get in touch with you as an executive director. Thank you so much for all your comments, for your thoughts, really, really inspiring. And I hope this is only one opportunity to continue connecting, okay? And thank you, everybody.
Oh, thank you very much, Ngiyabonga. Much appreciated. I really enjoyed the conversation, and definitely I'm available. Let's have more conversations in future.
Okay, lovely. Gracias, Philani. Obrigada.